Good day. A few days ago, on 6th October 2021, a meeting took place at President Putin's country residence near Moscow, in which Putin brought together the top figures in Russia's energy industry, specifically and most specifically its gas industry. And this meeting was chaired by Putin himself, and he seems to have dominated the discussion, as, by the way, he often does. Now, I should say that we don't have a complete account of everything that was said at that meeting, but the Kremlin website has provided us with quite significant excerpts highlighting those particular parts of the discussion which took place at this meeting on 6th October, and which are the parts of the discussion which the Russian government, and of course Putin himself, want us, that is to say the rest of the world, and perhaps also people in Russia, to know about. And it is actually a most extraordinary discussion, and I would add that it reveals a very interesting side of Putin's personality, one which we do come across from time to time, which is of Putin, the manager, who is extremely well briefed on every aspect of every issue that he has to discuss or chair, but also something which is perhaps less common, which is a Putin who is, frankly, comes across as rather angry and who makes his feelings, his strong and angry feelings, fairly well known and fairly clear. Now, I say that because, as people who have been in contact with Putin will confirm, people, by the way, who include former US President Barack Obama, Putin, most of the time, in fact, nearly all the time, is an exceptionally polite man. Anyway, let's get back to this discussion, because this discussion, in which Putin showed himself to be, as I said, somebody with all the facts at his fingertips and able to make all kinds of important decisions, but also in which he showed himself to be angry, and angry with certain people, was about energy policy, and specifically about Russia's gas exports to the European Union. Now, this has become a very hot topic over the last few weeks and months. As we all know, especially those of us who live in Europe, European reserves of natural gas as we enter the winter period are perilously low. There's a lot of talk and worry that we might actually see power outages across Europe, that there might be lack of heating gas for European homes, that the problems have spread to Britain and perhaps are even particularly acute there. And of course, there's been much discussion as to the reasons for this, though it's probably fair to say that a large part of the European political class, which of course includes the European media class, has been pointing its finger and blaming Vladimir Putin and Russia. And to anticipate a little what I'm going to discuss in this program, I think it is the fact that Putin and Russia are being blamed for this crisis in Europe, which is the source of Putin's very thinly disguised and in fact rather obvious anger. But before I get into that, I think it's only fair to say why I think the problems that we are seeing with gas supply have struck Europe so badly this year. Now, this is a complex topic, but I think the first point to say is that though the problems in Europe are indeed acute, they are mirrored by similar problems right around the world. We have seen a major problem rises across the world in energy prices. Oil prices are now approaching high levels, though they're not yet historically high levels. And countries like China and India are running short on their energy supplies also. And in the case of China, there have been power cuts. And in the case of India, there have also been power cuts are apparently widely expected and appear to be imminent. So the European crisis in natural gas is one that reflects a general energy crisis across the world. And this energy crisis, in my opinion, which we see across the world, has certain underlying causes. The most important of these, the one that has made the situation so particularly difficult and acute this particular year, is one I have discussed in various programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, and on our Locals platform, which is that, in my opinion, we have seen a massive overheating of the US economy as a result of the over-ambitious spending policies of the Biden-Harris administration. For reasons best known to themselves, but which I suspect were linked to concerns about the midterm elections next year and possibly a desire to appear to match China's GDP growth, the United States government, the Biden-Harris administration, very unwisely, in my opinion, put its foot down on the fiscal and monetary accelerators as soon as it took office. The result was a staggering increase in money emission in the United States, which to my mind is at the source of the worldwide inflation that we are seeing. Now, that is a complex and big subject, one which I'm not going to discuss in detail here, but it is one, by the way, which, as we will see, this view that the United States government's fiscal and monetary policies are at the root of some of the immediate problems. It is one that Putin himself shares. But let's put that aside, and let's also mention that there have been other problems too, and that is that over the last few years, obviously, there's been this major program in many countries, in fact, in most of the big economies, to move away from fossil fuels, which produce carbon and which produce all the concerns and worries about climate change that we hear so much about. And that has meant that there have been changes across the world in the energy mix of the big economies. So we see less coal, far less coal used in big economies than we once did, especially in Europe and in Britain, by the way. We see also that in some economies, and this is specific to Europe, there's also been a move away from oil-powered stations are no longer power stations, are no longer as common as they once were. And we've also seen, on top of that, a decline in the industrialized West in the use of nuclear power. Now, that is perhaps somewhat remarkable because at one time, nuclear power did seem to be the energy of the future, but it is what has actually happened. So after the Fukushima accident in Germany, after the Fukushima accident in Japan, we saw that Germany closed down all its nuclear power stations. Britain has stopped building nuclear power stations in any quantity, despite at one time having an ambitious plan to do precisely that. Even the French nuclear power industry is stagnating, as is that in the United States. And the result is that without energy coming from coal and energy coming from oil, and with less energy coming from nuclear power, the industrialized countries of the West have increasingly turned to two options for energy generation. One is windmill power, which seems to have become the preferred mechanism for alternative energy, especially in Northern Europe, but I believe also in some parts of the United States. And the other, of course, is natural gas. And natural gas, which is the topic of today's program, has certain advantages in the sense that it's actually extremely efficient to use, especially as a heating source. So you can pipe gas to people's homes, and that way you can get their central heating and hot water systems working very efficiently. And it is also a good source for electricity generation in power stations. And the great advantage of natural gas as well is that, especially by comparison with coal and oil, it has a low carbon footprint. It is not obviously, it obviously does have some carbon footprint, but it's not to be compared with windmill power and nuclear power in that respect. But it has a much smaller carbon footprint than coal and oil. And so it is possible, by substituting natural gas for coal and oil, for a country to reduce its carbon footprint considerably and thereby meet its carbon targets. And what we have seen across the industrialized West, but perhaps especially in Europe, over the last 30 or 40 years, is a steady move towards gas. Coal, which used to be, especially in Europe, the key source of energy generation, is now in steep decline. Oil has basically been abandoned for this purpose. Natural gas and windmill power have become the two most important, or at least the two most important growing areas of energy generation, as countries seek both to provide themselves with energy and at the same time seek to fulfill their carbon targets. And that, of course, brings us to the topic of our discussion today. Because if you are in Europe, where do you go for your natural gas? Well, Europe used to produce quite a lot of natural gas. The Netherlands, for example, used to produce natural gas, as did Norway, but that has been in decline now for some time. And in practice and in fact, much of the source of Europe's natural gas, around 40% of it, has come from Russia. And this, of course, has caused all sorts of political problems, because just as we don't like coal and we don't like oil and we don't like nuclear power in Europe, so a significant part of our political leadership and a large part of our population don't like Russia very much either. And that has created frictions and tensions between Europe and its primary supplier of natural gas. Even as the Europeans have moved steadily towards increasing their use of natural gas, so their relations, their political relations with their major gas supplier, which is to say Russia, have got steadily worse. We now find ourselves in a position of deep acrimony, one where political relations between the European Union and Russia have almost entirely broken down. And I'm going to say that, in fact, it is the issue of natural gas which is in many ways at the heart of the entire problem. Because one of the things that the Europeans wanted very much to do at the start of this century was to actually go into Russia themselves and develop the gas fields themselves and build the pipelines and extract the gas and send the gas up those pipelines into Europe. They wanted control, or at least they wanted to be involved in every part and aspect of the natural gas expansion and importation process. They wanted, in other words, Russia to become, in effect, Nigeria in the north, a country where European companies, primarily European companies, would be doing all the work and would be running, in effect, the energy side of the economy. But what happened at the start of this century is that the previous pro-Western liberal government of Mr. Yeltsin in Russia was replaced by the much more sovereigntist and far more tough-minded government of Mr. Putin. And Mr. Putin and the Russians said absolutely not to this idea. They said that it is Russia that will develop its gas fields, and it will Russia which will export the gas. And there is, in fact, a company, Gazprom, which is Russia's gas export monopoly, which is state-owned, though I would say that there are private gas companies in Russia which both extract gas and supply it on the Russian domestic market in competition with Gazprom. When people talk about Gazprom as a monopoly, they must understand that it is a monopoly of gas exports from Russia. It is not a pure monopoly within Russia itself. And that, I would add, has been a bitter source of contention between the Russians and the Europeans. And the Europeans famously produced something called the Third Energy Package, which is an EU law or legal system whereby companies, gas fields and gas pipelines and all the rest are supposed to be opened up to competition, which in effect means European competition. And they tried to get the Russians to agree to submit themselves to the Third Energy Package. And whilst the Yeltsin government appeared to say yes, and even signed on the dotted line, the Russian parliament refused to ratify the Third Energy Package, and Vladimir Putin, as president, has made it absolutely clear that he is not interested in it, and he has said a clear and emphatic no. And the Russians have gone even further. They said very clearly that they're not prepared to build pipelines to Europe which would be subjected to the dictates of the EU's Third Energy Package. Gazprom will build its pipelines. It will work on a contractual basis with European companies, but it will run its pipelines itself after it has built them. And that has been a major source of contention, and I suspect is the ultimate reason why relations between Europe and Russia have deteriorated so much. Okay, so that is a general introduction to the problems, the reasons why we have both a worldwide energy crisis, why we have a particular energy issues between Russia and Europe, and why natural gas is such a fraught issue. But what is it exactly that has happened this year over and above the worldwide inflation problem that I've been talking about, which leads us to this particular set of problems in Europe itself? Well, here one has to say that there's been an unusual, but hardly, if I might say, an remarkable or unprecedented conjunction of events. Firstly, the previous winter, last year's winter, was very cold and very long. And the result was that, of course, the Europeans had to use an awful lot of natural gas. Natural gas is difficult to store. Such natural gas as they can store, they do actually store quite a lot. They had to burn up to keep people's homes warm and to keep electricity running through the cold winter. And that left their reserves very depleted come the spring and summer. But then another problem happened because the summer months turned out to be quite hot and rather still. And that created a secondary problem in the European energy industry, because the windmills, which have now become so important for electricity generation, especially in Northern Europe, weren't turning at the speed and to the extent that that was previously expected and wanted. And that meant that since there was less energy, less electric power coming from the windmills, they had to go on using natural gas to provide people with electricity. And that, of course, delayed the extent to which they could stock up on natural gas. But then there was another factor that came into play, which is, of course, that there is a particular fact about Russia which Westerners always and consistently overlook, and that is that Russia is itself a major energy consumer. It is a huge country. It is very cold in winter. It was particularly cold last winter, by the way. And, of course, the Russians also have to use natural gas to keep Russian homes warm and to make sure that there is electricity, plenty of electricity for Russia and for Russia's economy to function. And that meant that because the winter in Russia was so cold, the Russians also went into the spring and summer with their gas reserves depleted. But then there is another factor which is also at play here, which is, of course, that the Russians don't depend as much on their export of gas on Europe as they once did. Because just as the political relations between Russia and the EU have deteriorated, so the EU has constantly harassed and pressured the Russians on energy and gas supply. There's been all those problems, for example, that I've discussed at such inordinate length on so many programs about Nord Stream 2, and which, by the way, remain unresolved. There were the sanctions that the EU imposed on the Russian oil and gas industry back in 2014. There have been endless lawsuits against Gazprom brought by the European Commission in Europe, and there's been constant media campaigns against Gazprom, against Russia, all sorts of talk about how Russia uses natural gas as a weapon to gain geopolitical advantage, something, by the way, for which there is no evidence. And this has persuaded the Russians that exporting gas to Europe, making Europe, in effect, the only major foreign importer of Russian gas, is not a good idea. So the Russians have built pipelines to the east, to China. And though those pipelines are still very much at their early stage, and the amount of gas that's flowing along those pipelines can't compare with the amount of gas that continues to flow towards Europe, nonetheless, the point is that the Russian natural gas industry is gradually becoming reoriented towards export of gas to China and to the Asia-Pacific region instead of to Europe. And that obviously means that entirely new infrastructure has been created, focused towards the east rather than towards Europe, and that has made it more difficult to supply Russian gas to Europe than it might otherwise have been if Europe and Russia had remained friendly towards each other and the Russians had continued to focus their entire weight of their natural gas industry on supplying Europe and Europe alone. And then there's been yet another factor that has been thrown into this strange mix, and that is, of course, that some of these natural gas fields in Russia that have been exporting gas to Europe have become increasingly depleted. And here perhaps I'm going to make another observation. Sometimes when one reads accounts about Russia and natural gas, there's almost this implicit assumption that the Russians can produce infinite amounts of natural gas and can simply do it by turning a switch. It never seems to occur to people that there are only finite amounts of natural gas, even in a country as vast as Russia. And in fact, that is indeed the case. The major natural gas fields in Russia, in Western Siberia and in central Russia, some of which started to be developed as long ago as the mid-1960s, have gradually become depleted. Now, it was those gas fields that supplied gas to Europe via the pipelines which currently pass through Ukraine. And because of the endless acrimony and disputes and arguments and quarrels between the Russians and the Ukrainians, those pipelines which pass Ukraine, which were built by the Soviet Union, are not apparently in particularly good condition, and their technology is old, dating from the 1970s and 1980s, and no longer up to the level of modern gas pipeline technology. And in addition to this, of course, there have been the perennial problems that the Russians have had with the Ukrainians siphoning gas that passes via Ukraine to Europe, and with the Ukrainians on occasions actually blocking Russian supplies of gas to Europe when they've had their own pricing disputes with the Russians, as happened in 2006, 2009. So, as the Russians have developed their new gas fields, which they have been doing over the last few years in the Arctic, they have built pipelines, or they have agreed with the Germans, the German suggestion, to build pipelines which go directly from the Arctic south across the Baltic Sea to Germany. And those, of course, are Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. And in fact, it makes better sense, it makes more obvious technological and geographic sense to send the gas along those new modern pipelines to Germany and to Europe than to go down this circuitous route, go all the way to central Russia, and then pipe the gas along those decrepit pipelines via Ukraine to Central Europe instead. In fact, as we're going to see in a moment, Gazprom feels that using Ukrainian pipelines is actually not cost effective anymore, and wants for that reason to switch to the Nord Stream pipelines, the two Nord Stream pipelines, instead, as being a much more efficient way and cost-effective way to supply Arctic natural gas to Europe. And then, of course, there's been another twist to this story, because I talked about those pipelines that the Russians have built to China. But, of course, it isn't just pipelines that the Russians have been building to China. They've also been working very hard over the last 10 years developing their own liquefied natural gas industry in the Arctic. And this is a gigantic program, one which gets very little attention in the West, but which is in fact a major game changer in terms of Russia's gas industry. And the liquefied natural gas can be more easily stored, it can be put on tankers, and it can be delivered across the seas and across the oceans to customers anywhere around the world. And by the way, at one time, the Russians were hoping that they would be able to export liquefied natural gas to the United States, but that didn't happen because of the development of the shale gas industry in the United States. But increasingly, liquefied natural gas from the Arctic has also been supplied to Asia, to China, and the other countries in the Asian Pacific region. And here again, we come up with a final twist to the story. Because of the cold winter in the Northern Hemisphere, because of the inflation crisis and the general rise in oil prices and energy prices, we see that the Asian producers have been scrambling to buy natural gas. And some of that natural gas, most of that natural gas, takes the form of liquefied natural gas. And that is supplied either by the Russians from the Arctic or by the Arab states from the Gulf. But the result is that it's been heading east towards the Asian economies, which have deep pockets and can pay large sums of money for their gas, and which also have no compunction about subsidizing their consumers. And it has not been going to Europe, deepening the problems that the Europeans have been experiencing this summer. So this strange conjunction of events, but as I said, a perfectly foreseeable one, one which proper energy experts could have prepared for, has resulted in a situation where the Europeans found that they had less gas in their reserves at the end of the summer than they needed to cover the winter period safely, and where the Russians were busy pumping gas into their own reserves and had less gas to sell to the Europeans. And now we come to perhaps the other thing which has happened, which is, of course, that just as the Europeans have been agitating against the Russians for a long time over the gas issue, one form which that gas agitation has taken, that endless criticism of Russia, is that Gazprom and the Russians have historically sought to lock in European customers into long-term contracts. Now, the point about these long-term contracts is, of course, that they supply gas at a specific price formula, one which is adjusted against oil prices, but which might not reflect the actual price movements for natural gas on the spot market. And that was unpopular because it sometimes meant that the Europeans were buying gas at higher prices than they might have got on the spot market. But it was also unpopular because of the perception that it was locking in Europe into long-term contracts with Gazprom and with Russia, and supposedly tying the Europeans into dependence, long-term dependence on Russia for their natural gas. So, under pressure from various economists, principally, as it turns out, from Britain, the Europeans gradually began to switch towards short-term contracts, towards buying gas, including gas from Russia, on the spot market at market prices, and instead of engaging Gazprom in long-term contracts. And what has been happening is that as the summer has ended and the Europeans have found that they don't have enough gas in their reserves to comfortably cover the winter, they found that while Gazprom continues to supply natural gas in accordance with those long-term contracts that are left, it's meeting all its contractual obligations, Gazprom has been less willing to enter into short-term contracts based on market spot prices, and because it just doesn't have the gas to spare. And it is the last thing that lies behind all the outcry in Europe, because what you see across Europe is various people who should know better grumbling and complaining that the Russians are deliberately withholding gas from the spot market. They're deliberately refusing to enter into these short-term contracts in order to create problems for the Europeans, in order to extract leverage from the Europeans by threatening them with a cold winter unless the Europeans make concessions to Russia. Now, what these concessions exactly are that the Russians are supposed to be holding out for, it's never made entirely clear. There's been suggestions that the Europeans should agree to exempt Nord Stream 2 from the third energy package, or agree to fast track Nord Stream 2's license so that it can provide gas immediately. Well, that might be true, but I haven't heard anything from the Russians to suggest that. But nonetheless, this narrative that the Russians are withholding gas from the spot market has been widely publicized across Europe and has become a common talking point on the part of European politicians and European commentators. And it is this now which brings me back to that meeting in Putin's country residence outside Moscow on the 6th of October, because he is furious about it. And I can't begin to say how clearly angry he is. But he, anyway, goes on to make a whole succession of comments. And he's made it quite clear where he thinks the problems come from. And I'm going to read out not the whole of this these extracts of this meeting that appear on the Kremlin website. You find a link to them below. But I'm going to read out some of the relevant points which Putin has made. First of all, he says the following. As you know, the global energy market does not tolerate hectic moves and vagaries. Investment plans in this area are long-term. Therefore, any abrupt and rash actions may lead, and judging by the current market situation, are already leading to serious imbalances like those we are seeing in the European market that has been affected this year by several unfavourable factors all at once. First, the rapid post-crisis recovery of the economy has heated up the energy demand. Now, the words heated up are put in quotation marks, and it's quite clear that what Putin is referring to is this massive fiscal and monetary splurge in the United States, which is causing worldwide inflation and which is partly responsible for the rise in energy prices, and which I spoke about at the start of this program. Anyway, second, gas reserves in many European countries' underground storage facilities dwindled as a result of the harsh winter in early 2021. I'm already referring precisely to their underground storage facilities, the underground storage facilities of our European partners. Third, the production of wind energy declined noticeably later in the summer because of hot and windless weather. It should also be taken into consideration that the energy balance has changed dramatically in Europe over the past 10 years. Many countries in the region have given up their coal-burning and nuclear power plants in favour of wind power generation that is heavily dependent on weather conditions. And finally, fourth, the practices of our European partners are to blame. These practices have reaffirmed that, properly speaking, they have made mistakes. We are talking with the former European Commission. All of its activities were aimed at curtailing long-term contracts and at transitioning to gas exchange trading. In other words, they did away with long-term contracts and went instead for trading on the spot market. And then Putin goes on to say as follows: it turned out, and today this is absolutely obvious, this policy is erroneous. Erroneous for the reason that it fails to take into account that gas market specifics depend on a large number of uncertainty factors. Consumers, including, for example, fertilizer producers, are losing all price benchmarks. All this is leading to failures and imbalances. And then he becomes increasingly angry as he talks about the various problems that have been arising. And he makes some incredibly harsh points about the way in which the Europeans have behaved and about how they have completely failed to understand the whole nature of the gas market. And he says things like this: overall, exchange trading, that's to say spot trading in gas, is not effective since it carries multiple risks. And we have always told them so. After all, this is not like trading in watches, underpants, or ties, or cars. It is not even like oil, which can be produced and stored anywhere, including in tankers, waiting for the market situation to clear up. Gas is different, since it cannot be stored this way. Even liquefied natural gas has to be produced, liquefied, loaded into tankers, delivered, and then converted back into gaseous state. This is a costly and complex process. It does not work like that. What we are seeing today is the result of their persistent, or to put it bluntly, careless actions, to say the least, with direct consequences for the market. I remember the discussions within the European Commission, and I have been to Brussels myself. I do not remember, but I think that you were there too. And now he's referring to some of the officials who were present. Talking to the so-called experts was not easy, since they tend to take a somewhat snobbish attitude and believe that their opinion is the only right one and do not want to hear anything else. I hope that this time something will change. And as to the experts that he is, of course, talking about, he is talking about the experts who suggested that the European Commission, the European countries, European consumers move away from long-term contracts to short-term contracts dependent on exchange trading, in other words, on the spot market. And this is what Putin had to say about those experts. The proposal to switch to an exchange trading system for natural gas came from European Commission experts under the previous mandate, mostly from British experts. Where are those British experts with their proposals now? We know where they are, but consumers in continental Europe have been left to suffer from these initiatives. So he's made it very clear, Putin has made it very clear, that the Russians will not accept any blame for the situation in Europe. It is the Europeans who have authored this catastrophe for themselves. Instead of working with Gazprom and agreeing long-term contracts with Gazprom, which would have provided European consumers with stable gas flows, which would have covered them for any foreseeable set of circumstances in the winter, they went to short-term exchange trading because they were, to state simply and straightforwardly, antagonistic to Russia and were looking to reduce their dependence upon it. The result is that now, when the Russians aren't able to come to those short-term agree those short-term exports because they're not their extra gas is principally going to Asia. There is none of that gas to be had, and that's true in terms of gas from other places because the Gulf producers are sending their gas, their liquefied natural gas, to Asia as well. So that's amongst some of the things that Putin had wanted to speak and had things to say. But he also had other things to say too, and of course he touched on the situation with respect to Ukraine as well. And this is a particularly fraught subject because, of course, we know that the Europeans have been insisting that the Russians must continue to send gas via Ukraine. even if it is not economical for the Russians to do that, even if the Russians don't want to do that. The Russians supposedly are obliged to send their gas via Ukraine, and if they don't, the Europeans will sanction them. Something which, as I said, is an astonishing interference by the Europeans in the commercial relations between two countries, Russia and Ukraine. It in fact says that Russia is under some kind of compulsion to send its gas via Ukraine and will be punished if it doesn't. Anyway, Putin has some very interesting things to say about that too. He said the following: Gazprom believes that it would be economically more expedient, more profitable for it to pay the fine imposed by Ukraine in order to be able to increase gas flow volume via the new systems. He's referring to Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. The pressure in the new pipe is higher, the carbon emissions are lower, and the overall costs are lower by around $3 billion per year. I have asked them not to do this. We must fully comply with contractual obligations regarding transit of our gas via Ukraine through the Ukrainian gas transit system. Nobody, including Ukraine, should be placed in a difficult situation, despite all the factors at play in Russian-Ukrainian relations. Second, we must not undermine trust in Gazprom as a reliable, absolutely reliable partner in all regards. Now, these words of Putin about Ukraine, by the way, have been misrepresented. What Putin is saying is that Gazprom must abide by its existing contracts with Ukraine, its existing gas transit contracts with Ukraine. Gazprom has contracts with Ukraine to send gas via Ukraine to Europe up to 2024. And it seems that Gazprom is becoming increasingly unhappy about this. Gazprom feels that sending gas via Ukraine is expensive and uneconomic, and it would rather break those contracts with Ukraine and send gas via Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 rather than through Ukraine and pay the price that it has to pay in sending it through Ukraine. In fact, Gazprom believes that the cost of breaking the contracts with Ukraine would still leave it in a better position financially overall if it supplied its gas instead via the new pipelines. And Putin said, despite the fact that it might make some kind of business sense, Gazprom shouldn't do that because Gazprom has to preserve its reputation as an utterly reliable gas supplier, and for that reason it must abide with its contracts with Ukraine, even if it is not economically justified for it to do so. Now, what that means is that come 2024, when these contracts between Gazprom and Ukraine expire, what it means is that Gazprom is not going to renew them, because it seems that Gazprom has already decided that it is not economic for Gazprom to send its gas to Europe via Ukraine. As I've said, the Ukrainian pipeline network, which is already in a poor condition, is not anyway configured to supply the gas to Europe from Russia's new Arctic fields. So it makes more sense for Russia to send the gas to Europe from these Arctic fields via Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 than it is to send them via Ukraine. So for that reason, it seems to me that Ukraine's future as a transit state is now all but over. Gazprom is not going to want to extend its contracts or to negotiate new contracts with Ukraine beyond 2024-2025. And if that means that the Europeans sanction Gazprom and sanction Russia, well, so be it. So Putin has in effect confirmed that Ukraine's position as a gas transit state is ending in just a few years. And perhaps it's an important fact to take away from the words set out in this meeting. And then the last point that he made, which I found extremely interesting, is that he talked about the extraordinary energy mix that the Europeans now have. Because I said how they'd basically abandoned their nuclear power and were relying increasingly on natural gas. But it's also the case that because they've basically stopped using nuclear power, they're relying increasingly also on coal, despite all its problems with carbon emissions. And this is some of the comments. These are some of the comments that were made at this meeting. These are some of the comments made by a Russian official, not Putin, who actually spoke at that meeting on this precise question. And this official said the following: Germany is at the forefront of efforts to reduce carbon emissions. However, what is really happening? The price in Germany is 10 times higher, while coal-fired stations account for 27% of the country's energy mix, compared to 13% in Russia. For this reason, it is strange when you fight for carbon neutrality with prices that high and twice the share of coal in the energy mix compared to the Russian Federation. And then Putin came back. You were quite right to ask how they can fight for carbon neutrality. If the share of coal in the energy balance in Europe, and in this case we're talking about Germany, is twice as high as in Russia, well, it turns out that they can. This is what the Europeans are doing and trying to do at someone else's expense. In this case, they're trying to do this at our expense, at the expense of the Russian Federation. I really do hope that we will be able to launch a dialogue on this subject, taking into consideration the interests of all sides on the global energy market. So let's sum up this meeting. It was a complicated meeting, a very interesting one. As I said, a very angry Putin, a Putin extremely well briefed about every aspect of the energy situation, not just in Europe, but around the world. Putin has outlined the reasons, the problems for the crisis in the natural gas industry in Europe this winter. Many of them are the problems I outlined at the start of this programme. He is particularly angry that the Europeans destroyed their relationship with Gazprom, a relationship which had appeared solid only a few years ago, harassing and campaigning against Gazprom relentlessly, and demanding that long-term contracts with Gazprom be replaced by short-term contracts with the price fixed on the spot market. He's pointed out that this takes away any ability to plan long-term, and that this is the primary reason why Europe this year finds itself short of gas. He also has effectively signalled that post-2024, 2025, Ukraine's position as a gas transit state ends. And last but not least, he has said some very sardonic things about the hypocrisy of the Europeans in preaching constantly to the Russians and everyone else about carbon emissions, even though they use coal to a much greater extent in their energy mix than the Russians do. The Russians instead use natural gas and nuclear power to meet their electricity needs which is not what the Germans do. So, there we are, an angry Putin. Now, the media in the West has, in my opinion, misrepresented this statement. It has suggested that Putin came along and held this meeting and said to all the executives there, well, the Europeans have this problem. Let's see what we can do to help them. Let's try and find a way to solve the energy crisis in Europe. When you read the comments that were actually made at this meeting carefully, you discover that that is not really what Putin was saying. What he was saying was, look, we will do what we can. We will fulfill our contracts. We always fulfill our contracts, even when those contracts are bad for us, as our contracts with Ukraine are. We will fulfill our contracts. Obviously, as gas becomes available on the spot market, when our own reserves are filled, that will probably be in late October, early November, we will be able at that point to start supplying more gas to the Europeans. But ultimately, this problem is entirely of their own making. They have wrecked their relationship with us, and we are absolutely not going to accept that we are responsible for the situation in any way at all. The people who run energy policy in the European Union are a bunch of ideologues and amateurs. They don't understand the energy market. They don't understand the natural gas industry. They don't understand how energy works. They have completely sacrificed Europe's energy security to geopolitical and ideological objectives and to their fixation with Russia and their hostility towards Russia and Gazprom. And if the European consumers this year are having all those problems, well, that is the fault of the European Commission and those free market obsessed British experts, also undoubtedly British experts who are so hostile to Russia, as the British establishment always is, who the European Commission was so unwise to listen to. So this is absolutely not a meeting of Putin rushing to Europe's rescue or setting out to stabilize energy prices. On the contrary, what he is basically saying is that this is a very intractable situation. It's going to be very difficult to see what Russia can do to cool the situation down. Perhaps some things can be done, but ultimately this is a crisis created in Europe, and it is the Europeans who must take the blame for it. So, an interesting meeting, a meeting which shows, to my mind, the extent of the anger and exasperation that there is today in Moscow towards the EU and pretty much everything that it does. I would have to say, though, that even if you put aside these questions of anger and the, I suppose one should say, defensiveness of some of Putin's remarks, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that ultimately he is right. The way the Europeans needed to stabilise to secure their energy position was to remain on good terms with their long-term principal energy supplier. One would have thought that was obvious. It's not, after all, as if this energy supplier is making any extreme demands of them. The days when Moscow wanted to decide what kind of government should be in power in Berlin or Prague or Warsaw, not to mention Paris or London, well, all of that is long gone. What the Russians have said is, let's have a good, stable commercial relationship. And the Europeans didn't want that. They wanted instead, firstly, to get the Russians to agree to open up their gas industry to the Europeans so that the Europeans could go into Russia and take control of it. And, of course, when the Russians said no, we've seen this endless steady deterioration in relations between the Russians and the Europeans ever since, and this constant pressure on Russia, which has brought relations to the point of crisis. And the people who are now paying the price are the European consumers. Well, will the Europeans pay any attention? Will they listen to this? I doubt it very much. The ability of European leaders ever to accept that they are wrong, that they have made any mistakes, is, to put it mildly, limited. In practice and in fact, I think it is non-existent. And I would add that in relation to the structure of the energy industry, there's been a most extraordinary article, or rather editorial, in the Financial Times, which, by the way, alludes to what Putin said and shows that European, or at least Western, certainly British attitudes on gas policy have not changed despite the dangers of a cold Europe that Europe is facing. I say that, of course, the Financial Times is a British newspaper. Britain is no longer part of the European Union, but the Financial Times remains ardently pro-European, and I've no doubt that it reflects the views of many European officials. And it reads as follows: Putin has taunted smart Alex in Brussels, who he says have exacerbated today's problems by pushing for market-based pricing in an effort to boost competition in gas. Notice that the Financial Times refers to smart Alex, and he puts that in quotation marks, implying that these were the words Putin used. He didn't use those words. He specifically referred to British experts, but the Financial Times doesn't want to say that or acknowledge that fact. And it also speaks about Putin placing all the problems by saying that the experts, these smart Alex experts, actually British experts, had pushed for a market-based pricing. In fact, again, Putin didn't actually use the word market-based pricing. He spoke about exchange trading, which is something quite different. In other words, trading on the spot market. The distinction he was making was between long-term contracts and short-term ones. Anyway, to continue. Yet, while being ready to shield the most vulnerable from sharp winter price swings, EU countries should not retreat from market mechanisms, but seek to strengthen and complete them. They should insist on transparent pricing, unbundling, and third-party access to pipeline networks, including for Russia. So, we see that the Europeans, as reflected by the Financial Times, despite the crisis they are now facing, are not prepared to budge at all. They insist on short-term contracts, what they call market mechanisms. They also insist on what they call transparent pricing. The reason they talk about transparent pricing is because long-term contracts often are confidential in many of their terms, and of course they insist that these contracts should be public and open, which is arguably a fair case, but there are arguments against it. They then talk about unbundling, which, by the way, means that Gazprom should not control the pipelines, and they talk about third-party access to pipeline networks, including for Russia. In other words, the Europeans should be allowed to go into Russia and exploit the Russian gas fields themselves, develop those gas fields, build all those pipelines, convert Russia into Nigeria in the snow. So they're not prepared to shift, change, alter their policies in any way. It seems to me that what this shows is the complete inability of European leaders, and especially British leaders too, to change even in the face of gathering disaster. I don't know how bad the situation is actually going to be this winter in Europe. Perhaps it's not going to be as bad as people say. But it's quite clear that European leaders, European ministers, EU commissioners, British experts are not prepared to learn from their mistakes at all. They will continue to preserve this confrontational policy towards their primary energy supplier, even to the point where the people of Europe get cold and hungry in winter. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this long programme on this fraught and difficult topic. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future for future programmes, both on this channel and on our main channel, The Duran, where I do programmes with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check us out on our other platforms, especially Locals, where we now have a thriving community and where we're publishing increasing amounts of exclusive content. And you can also find us on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially the free speech platform SuperU. Please also remember to check us out, or rather you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also remember to go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And if you like this video on this complex subject, please remember to press the like button, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.